Hello, welcome to this video about the history of the Middle East. It's a region you might know from the news, or perhaps your family has roots there. This video will take you through the major events, notable figures, and key issues in the Middle East's history to help you understand the region of today. When we talk about countries like Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, we're referring to the Middle East. While this term originates from Europe, since the region lies eastward from there, it's not the Far East like China, Indonesia, or Japan. If you look at a globe, you'll see the Middle East approximately between Europe and the Far East. Some call it the Near East, while others refer to it as West Asia, but all these terms denote the same place. In this video, we'll discuss the origins of the countries I just mentioned, the peoples who inhabit them, and the often complex relationships between those countries and peoples. We'll also explore the causes of the decline and fall of the Ottoman Empire and the consequences it had for the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire was a world empire that lasted over 600 years, and because its center was in the Middle East, understanding the region's history requires knowledge of the Ottoman Empire. So, let's briefly delve into the Ottoman Empire. It was founded in 1299 by the Islamic Sultan Osman Jurab. The name Ottoman originates from Europeans struggling to pronounce Osman correctly. For 6 centuries, the Muslim Empire was ruled by direct descendants of Osman Permat, who referred to themselves as sultans, meaning rulers or kings. In the 17th century, the empire reached its peak, stretching from Morocco to Iraq and from Hungary to Ethiopia, with influence extending even further. At its zenith in 1683, the Ottomans even besieged the city of Vienna in Austria. The Ottoman sultans played a significant role in spreading Islam and facilitating spice trade between Europe and Asia. After conquering Constantinople in 1453 and renaming it Istanbul, they made it their capital. Today, Istanbul is in the Republic of Turkey, and many Turks consider their country the successor to the Ottoman Empire. Despite its significant victories and unquestionable status as a global power, the Ottoman Empire earned the moniker the sick man of Europe from the 18th century onward, indicating its rapid decline. While Europe experienced unprecedented technological advancement in the 18th century due to the scientific revolution, Enlightenment, and Industrial Revolution, the Ottomans lagged behind. Many of the Sultan's advisors were conservative clerics who staunchly opposed any form of progress. Consequently, the once mighty Ottomans fell further behind Europeans. Add to that a series of weak sultans who ruled for short periods, and the result is evident. The world empire was crumbling. However, as is often the case in history, there's never just one reason for events. It would take over a century until the definitive collapse of the empire in 1920. The Ottoman Empire fell behind technologically and was poorly governed, leading to its power crumbling. Another internal cause was the rise of nationalist sentiments, a phenomenon occurring in many parts of the world at that time. Nationalism stems from pride in one's own people and the struggle for a nation's right to self-governance. The Ottoman Empire was a multinational empire with many ethnicities living within its borders, and although it was Islamic, it tolerated other religions. With the rise of nationalism among the various peoples within the empire, numerous issues arose. The Greeks, Serbians, and Bulgarians began fighting for their independent states, succeeding in breaking away from the Ottoman Empire and establishing their own nations. Thus, the Ottoman Empire began to shrink. Concurrently, a nationalist movement emerged among the Turks themselves, known as the Young Turks. Mostly comprised of high-ranking military officers, they aimed to modernize the empire, halt its decline, and keep European powers at bay. They also sought to make Turks the dominant ethnic group at the expense of others like Armenians, Kurds, and Arabs, who were encouraged to assimilate into Turkish culture. However, this only fueled nationalist sentiments among these groups, particularly the Arabs, who began organizing and dreaming of their own land. The West capitalized on this division within the Ottoman Empire, seeing an opportunity to further weaken the empire and strengthen their own position in the region, especially Britain and France, who were expanding their empires throughout the 19th century. So, here we come to the external causes for the end of the Ottoman Empire. Firstly, the modern imperialism of European countries sought resources to sustain the Industrial Revolution and markets to sell their industrial products. In doing so, they also aimed to extend their political and cultural influence. In the 19th century, when the Suez Canal opened in Egypt in 1869, Significantly reducing travel time between Europe and Asia by 40%, Britain managed to gain control of the canal. They also occupied countries like Cyprus and Sudan to secure the shipping route. Additionally, with the discovery of oil at the end of the 19th century, shortly after the invention of the gasoline engine, the region became strategically vital. The Middle East transformed from a region previously on the sidelines of world politics into one of the most fiercely contested hotspots. The Ottomans stood by and watched as their empire crumbled. During World War I from 1914 to 1918, the Ottomans aligned with Germany and Austria-Hungary. However, this choice would prove costly. During the war, the Allies France and Britain conspired to decide the fate of the Ottoman Empire if they were to win the war. The two nations signed the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, dividing the Middle East into mandate territories between themselves, acting as if the Ottoman Empire no longer existed. This agreement, with its arbitrary borders, would lead to many future problems in the region. During the war, the British sent diplomat Lawrence of Arabia, promising the Arabs a large, independent Arab state. However, the Arabs felt betrayed when the Treaty of Sèvres was signed in 1919, confirming that there would be no Arab state. Instead, the agreements of the Sykes-Picot Agreement were upheld, and the Middle East remained divided between France and Britain. On the smoldering remains of the Ottoman Empire, after the tumultuous 19th century with the opening of the Suez Canal, nationalist movements, and European imperialism, the Republic of Turkey was founded in 1923. This republic was proclaimed by Turkish military officer Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, often referred to as the father of the Turks. He established the Republic of Turkey with the aim of leaving behind the conservative Ottoman legacy. Ataturk wanted to rid his modern country of the influence of religion and establish a secular state with a separation of mosque and state akin to Europe, with himself as the sole ruler. Turkey emerged as a new nation-state, while the Arabs were left behind in a region torn apart, deeply disappointed, and with the physical reminder of artificial borders. They remembered how treacherous Western imperialism could be. Previously in the video, mainly two major ethnic groups were discussed, the Turks and the Arabs. However, the Jewish people also have a long and tumultuous history in this region. First, let's briefly discuss the history of the Jewish people, and then I'll delve into the detailed history of the formation of the State of Israel. The history of the Jewish people dates back far before our era and largely unfolds in present-day Egypt and Israel. Jews not only constitute a religious group but also a cultural community united by ancient rituals and a shared history. This history is characterized by both cultural, economic, and scientific prosperity, as well as poverty and oppression. Around the year 0, the then Jewish kingdom of Judea was annexed by the Roman Empire. However, after a bloody uprising in the year 70, the holy city of Jerusalem was destroyed, and the Jews themselves were expelled from their homeland. From that moment on, the Jewish people became increasingly dispersed throughout the world. This dispersion, known as the diaspora, a Greek word meaning scattering, saw Jews as immigrants everywhere, forming minorities with an unfamiliar faith, their own rituals, language, and a strong sense of community. They often faced exclusion and persecution, a specific form of hatred and discrimination against Jews known as anti-Semitism. The absolute low point of anti-Semitism is the Holocaust or the Shoah, when the regime in Germany deliberately murdered around 6 million Jews. But more on that later. Under the influence of the nationalism of the 19th century, which I already discussed, the Jews also began to long for a homeland of their own. Additionally, the growing nationalism in European countries further marginalized them, even though some Jewish families had lived in those countries for centuries. The desire of the Jews to return to the land of their ancestors, now called Palestine, is known as Zionism, named after the holy mountain Zion near Jerusalem. The history of the formation of Israel thus begins with nationalism and Zionism at the end of the 19th century. Unlike other nationalist movements in the Ottoman Empire, which mainly targeted peoples already living in the empire, Zionism was a global movement. The founding father of this international Zionist movement was Mr. Theodor Herzl. He wrote a bestseller calling on Jews to leave anti-Semitic Europe and establish their own state in Palestine within the Ottoman Empire. Although the Ottoman Sultan was hardly enthusiastic about these plans, the British saw potential in Zionism. For the British, there were many benefits to having a pro-British Jewish state with allies in the region, as they would have free access to oil fields and the Suez Canal. Moreover, Palestine fell under their future mandate territory, as I mentioned earlier. The British government publicly expressed their support for a national home for the Jewish people with the Balfour Declaration in 1917, named after the Foreign Secretary. However, it was not supposed to be an exclusively Jewish state, but rather a cooperative project between Arabs and Jews for the development of all of Palestine. But due to the massive influx of Jews into Palestine and the growing nationalism of the Arabs living there, tensions between the two peoples escalated, leading to frequent conflicts. David Ben-Gurion was the leader of the Jews, under whom many highly educated European Jews could rapidly organize and develop. In contrast, the Arab Palestinians, often poor farmers, had little recourse. After the large-scale persecution of Jews during the Holocaust, when millions of Jews were hunted down, deported, and murdered in organized campaigns by the Nazis, the shock among European politicians was enormous. If there was a moment when the call for a Jewish state was strongest, it was after the Holocaust. The Holocaust is still seen by many Israelis today as the justification for the existence of Israel, yet the large numbers of Jews arriving in Palestine further heightened tensions in the period between 1945 and 1948. The British failed to restore order in their mandate territory. The United Nations, established after World War II to maintain world peace, decided that both parties would receive roughly half of the territory in Palestine. But the Palestinians rejected this. Violence between Arabs and Jews increased, and the Jews carried out systematic, targeted actions against the Arabs. However, the Islamic Arabs, who nowadays call themselves Palestinians, also engaged in violence during this period, seeking to distinguish themselves from the Jewish Israelis. Both groups see the other primarily as perpetrators and themselves primarily as victims. Yet during this period, bloody attacks were carried out on both sides. David Ben-Gurion, who had been one of the most important figures in the Zionist movement for decades, declared the independence of Israel on May 14, 1948, establishing it as an independent Jewish state. Surrounded by an extremely hostile Arab world, what was a miraculous year for Israelis was a disastrous year for Palestinians. Israel soon became a military protected by a state-of-the-art army that still exists today. Despite the fact that Israel was constantly at war with Arab countries in the first year after its establishment, and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled the country, the population doubled as Jewish migration from Europe to their new homeland continued unabated. An anti-Arab attitude from the Israelis fueled feelings of injustice and loss among the Arabs. From the Arab perspective, it was yet another wave of Western Europeans coming to take over their land, and that, in a nutshell, is the background up to now. But how did the Arab world react to their new Jewish neighbor? When I refer to the Arab world, I mean countries where predominantly Arabs live, such as Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. The main connecting factor among the Arabs is the Arabic language and culture, common history, and Islam, although the latter is not equally significant for every Arab, and there are Arabs with different religions as well. Egypt, with by far the largest Arab population, has traditionally been of great cultural importance to the Arab world. Egypt also took the lead in both words and deeds in the fight against Israel. Gamal Abdel Nasser, who revived Arab nationalism and stoked hatred against Israel, came to power in Egypt in 1952. Arab nationalism was not only anti-Israel but also strongly opposed to Western presence in the region. For example, the British still controlled the Suez Canal. In Iraq and Syria, more and more parties were founded to fight for the unification of the Arab people into a united Arab state. It is important to know that this is not an Islamic movement. Most parties advocate for a secular state where religion is separate from social and political life. In the second half of the 20th century, which brings us to the present, the Cold War between the capitalist West led by the United States and the communist East led by the Soviet Union was ongoing. The countries of the Middle East also took sides, and it's not hard to guess that the Arab world didn't harbor warm feelings toward the West, especially since Israel was the closest ally of the U.S. Arab leaders therefore sided with the Soviet Union, which provided support with weapons and money. The Arab countries were united by their hatred of Israel, the resurgence of Arab nationalism, and friendly relations with the Soviet Union. During this period, The Arab countries also formed the Arab League to foster unity and advocate for the common interests of Arab nations. A major goal of the League was to combat the State of Israel. Multiple wars were fought between the Arab world and Israel during this time. I will briefly mention three of them. Firstly, there was the Suez Crisis in 1956, when Egypt's strong leader, Mr. Nasser, believed that the canal should belong to Egypt. He occupied the canal, but not without a fight. Together with the French and, surprisingly, the Israelis, the British attacked Egypt. This was yet another proof for the Arab world that Israelis were not to be trusted. It wasn't until the U.S. intervened and demanded that France, Great Britain, and Israel withdraw their soldiers that peace was restored. Nasser had won and was allowed to keep his canal. 11 years later, in 1967, a war with the not-so-mysterious name of the Six-Day War occurred, as it lasted 6 days. Led by Syria and Egypt, the Arab world called for driving the Zionists into the sea, but to everyone's surprise, Israel struck first with their defense. Large parts of the Arab world were now occupied by Israeli soldiers, including Jerusalem, where the historical center of the city lies with holy sites for both Jews and Muslims. East Jerusalem, which was assigned to the Palestinians, was occupied. Israel said, "If the Arab countries recognize us, we are willing to give the land back." But the Arab League decided against peace with Israel, refusing to recognize Israel or negotiate with it. It remained quite tumultuous in the region, and on the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur in 1973, when many Israeli soldiers were with their families, the Egyptians and Syrians struck again. While the U.S. hastily provided support to Israel, the Soviet Union once again sided with the Arab world. With these powerful countries intervening, there was a risk of a much larger conflict with the possibility of nuclear bombs being used. But fortunately, it didn't come to that. The Yom Kippur War ended with a ceasefire. After these three wars, a new phase in the relations between Israel and the Arab world began. Led by the U.S., attempts were made to restore peace and stability in the Middle East. Years of negotiations eventually led to the Camp David Accords in 1979, signed between Egypt and Israel. However, within Israel, a new period of oppression began for the Palestinians. A new political party came to power, claiming that the Palestinian territories also belonged to the Jewish people. The government actively built Jewish settlements in Palestinian territory, whose residents are called settlers, with the message, "We establish land here and will never leave." These settlements are considered illegal according to international law, but not by Israel. For the Palestinians, however, these settlers were occupiers, and the only way to regain their land was through armed struggle against the Zionists. Furthermore, the Palestinians felt abandoned by their Arab brothers who, after the Camp David Accords, wanted to build friendly relations with Israel. Therefore, among the Palestinians, a Palestinian nationalism emerged, and militant Palestinians began guerrilla actions against Israel. These included small-scale, swift attacks on Israeli civilians and soldiers, as well as international actions to draw attention to their goals. Worldwide, there were hostage-taking, airplane hijackings, and terrorist attacks. Remarkably, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, engaged in violence back and forth, leading to new feelings of revenge and violence, which were seen as provocation, and so on. The conflict has no clear beginning or instigator. There have been dozens of larger and smaller outbreaks of violence, making it difficult to determine who the villain is and who the victims are. Ultimately, people on both sides have suffered, but ultimately, you cannot understand the conflict without knowing the history, which begins with British promises to both Jews and Arabs, but also includes the injustice of the Holocaust, the resurgence of Arab nationalism, the large Palestinian refugee flows that began in the region, and the changing relations between the Palestinians and the rest of the Arab world. There are many explanations for the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, and there is not just one correct explanation. It depends on who you ask. I have to admit that we managed quite a long time without really discussing religion, but in this section we can't avoid it. After all, the Middle East is the birthplace of three of the world's major religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Each of these religions has left its mark on the region, which can be seen in holy sites, places of worship, but also in the identities of the inhabitants throughout the region. Today, the largest religious group in the Middle East is formed by Muslims. Those who are Muslim adhere to Islam and believe in one God, Allah, which means God in Arabic. Muslims also believe that Muhammad is his prophet, who received and conveyed the message of Allah through the angel Gabriel. Eventually, scholars compiled these messages and wrote them down in the holy book of Muslims, the Quran. The two main branches within Islam are Sunni and Shia, somewhat akin but not entirely comparable to Protestants and Catholics, both of which are Christian. The Islamic branches emerged early in the history of Islam in the 7th century. The main point of contention was who should succeed the Prophet Muhammad as the leader of the Muslims. Two camps emerged, each advocating for a different individual as successor, either Muhammad's son-in-law or a prominent ruler of the Middle East. I'm omitting many important details here to avoid making it a theological narrative, but for now it's important to know that the majority of the Islamic world is Sunni, with Shiites forming the minority everywhere except in Iran and parts of Iraq. Iran takes center stage for the rest of this video, as a revolution broke out there in 1979, profoundly changing the course of Middle Eastern history. Returning to the backstory of the Iranian Revolution, it begins with Western interest in Iran's rich oil reserves. Therefore, Western countries formed friendly ties with the rulers of Iran. Since 1941, that had been a king known as the Shah in Persian, the language of Iran. His name was Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. In the 1950s, with U.S. support, he had gained absolute power by adapting the country's culture and ancient traditions to be more Western. However, Shah Reza was not popular among many Iranians, except for a small urban middle class that benefited from his pro-Western policies. In practice, Iran was a dictatorship under Shah Reza. Political opponents were mass arrested, and the most important religious leaders were exiled abroad. After nearly 40 years on the throne, the dissatisfaction among so many people had grown so great that they dared to take to the streets. Then the bomb exploded. Millions of Iranians from all walks of life demanded change. Everyone had their own motives, including religious, intellectual, socialist, liberal, democratic, simple farmers, and small business owners. But the main current was formed by those who wanted their old familiar traditions and rituals back to the principles of old Iran. And that's the Iranian Revolution. After a period of disorder and chaos, Islamic clerics took power, immediately reversing modernizations and then rebuilding the country based on the conservative Shiite Islamic model. Corporal punishments were reintroduced, opponents were imprisoned, exiled, and executed. Various Western customs, such as cinemas, were strictly prohibited. The new leader of Iran was not a king or president, but an Ayatollah, the most important religious figure within Shiite Islam. The developments in Iran were certainly revolutionary in Arab countries. There, political parties were advocating for secularization, that is, the separation of religion from politics. But in Iran, Islam became the foundation of a new society which also inspired others, for example, in Turkey and Egypt, where similar fundamentalist movements emerged and gained great popularity among broad segments of the population. The foundation of society had to be formed by the traditional principles of Islam, and thus fundamentalism stood in opposition to secularism, which seeks to separate religion and politics. According to the fundamentalists, this was a Western idea, and therefore a form of imperialism in almost every country. In the Middle East, fundamentalist parties emerged after the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Hence, the revolution was a turning point. The parties all turned vehemently against the West and against Israel, whereas in the preceding years, a new peaceful path had been taken. Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Taliban are all examples of fundamentalist organizations that, through a lot of violence, particularly suicide bombings, spread fear worldwide. This marked a new phase in relations between the Middle East and the West. But tensions also increased within the Middle East. Fundamentalists came into direct conflict with secularists, even within their own countries. The divisions between Shiites and Sunnis became painfully clear, for example in the war between Shiite Iran and Sunni Iraq. From 1980 to 1988, in that war, Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq, was supported by the United States. But when Saddam Hussein invaded his neighbor Kuwait in 1990, he overplayed his hand. To protect their access to the oil reserves in that country, the U.S. sent over 500,000 soldiers to the region. Kuwait was liberated and Saddam was pushed back but allowed to remain in power. The U.S. was afraid of chaos if Saddam were to be ousted. Nevertheless, Iraq was heavily punished, but Saddam tried to get out of it every time. This cat-and-mouse game led the Americans to return to Iraq in 2003, this time to truly occupy the country. Saddam went into hiding but was pulled out of his hiding place by American soldiers in December 2003. It marked a new phase in relations between the Middle East and the West. This time it was not the British but the Americans who played a major role. As a result, many inhabitants of the Middle East turned even more fiercely against the West, and particularly against America, than in the century before. This phase in history, from the Iranian Revolution to the beginning of the 21st century, ushered in a new period. And in the background, economic, social, and nationalist interests still play a role, but conflicts more often revolve around religion. With the events and developments I've discussed in this video, I hope to provide a general overview of the history of the Middle East. I've summarized and highlighted the main points, but this is by no means the entire history. If you're interested in a more detailed explanation of a specific event in Middle Eastern history or any other event, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more explainer videos about our history.